Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, October 17th, 2022, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. It's my birthday week. Yep, turning the big 3-9. It's a rough one. I know many of you who have been there, done that, are like, yeah. And I know the big 4-0 will be interesting and it'll be a milestone, but there's something about like entering the last year of your 30s that's kind of existential. But that'll be happening soon. We get a little existential on the show this week. It's a really fun one for you guys. I love having conversations with this week's guest. But before we dive into it, I do want to thank those of you who continue to make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, Talk Nerdy's free. It's always going to be free. If you want to listen to it, you can listen to it. You may have to listen to some ads, but that's the way capitalism works, right? This helps me keep the show going. So I sell ads on the show, but I also rely on the support of individuals like you. And if you want to be a patron of the show, you can actually listen to the show without ads. I think as little as $2 an episode will get you an ad-free version of the show. So all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy. And you can read all about the perks there. I do want to give a shout out to this week's top patrons. They include Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Dudas Infinitas, Gabriel F. Jaramillo Gonzalez, Joe Wilkinson, Leonard Prince, Pasquale Gelati, Patrick Flynn, and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all so much. All right, so let's talk about this week's episode. For the third time now, I had the opportunity to chat with physicist Dr. Sean Carroll. He recently got a new appointment. He is the Homewood Professor of Natural Philosophy at Johns Hopkins University and fractal faculty at the Santa Fe Institute. He's also the host of the Mindscape podcast, and he's written multiple books. We've had him on the show to talk about From Eternity to Here, The Big Picture, Arrow of Time, there's the particle at the end of the universe, Something Deeply Hidden. But he's got a new book right now. It's called The Biggest Ideas in the Universe, Space, Time, and Motion. It's the first in a series of 3 books on the biggest ideas in the universe. And it's just like fundamentally important because it helps you understand basic physics. Now, we're going to talk a bit about basic physics on the show. We're going to talk about so much more. This was a really interesting and fun and meaningful chat for me, and I hope that you feel the same way. So without any further ado, here he is, Dr. Sean Carroll. Well, Sean, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me, Cara.
And on a Saturday to boot. That's very kind of you.
We work hard. We never stop.
We do.
The knowledge never takes a break.
Okay, so we just spent a lot of time catching up offline, and I'm going to do the quick and dirty catch up online because, anybody who's been with me on Talk Nerdy for since 2014, you were one of my earliest guests. You were on the show March 24th, 2014. Jeez.
Yeah, that's years ago.
Yeah. And then again in 2019. And so a lot has changed since then. I'm now in Florida working on my PhD internship, and you are in Baltimore.
Mm-hmm. I am. I'm at Johns Hopkins. Right? I have the world's best job title. I'm the Homewood Professor of Natural Philosophy, which means that I both do philosophy and physics. And it's exactly me. They made a job that is exactly what I want to do. Couldn't be happier.
And so how did they actually, I'm just curious from a logistical perspective, are you matrixed into the physics department and the philosophy department? Or like where is your professorship housed?
I'm spread over there. It's spooky action at a distance where I have an office in the physics department and an office in the philosophy department. And I'm teaching courses in both places.
Oh, okay, cool. And so are your physics courses like basic or clean physics courses, or are they like with some philosophy thrown in, and then your philosophy courses are like physicsy philosophy, or do you kind of keep them separate?
Nothing is basic and clean. That would be too much because I'm also fractal faculty at the Santa Fe Institute, and I'm a faculty affiliate at the Agora Institute for Democracy at Johns Hopkins. So I'm just doing like a little bit of everything. My physics course, the course I'm teaching right now that counts as physics, is called the Physics of Democracy, where I use ideas from physics to think about phase transitions and inequality and social organization, self-organization, things like that. And the philosophy course I'm teaching is philosophy of physics. So a little bit of everything gets mixed in.
Oh, I love that so much. I remember when I was an undergrad, way back when, I was a psychology major and a philosophy minor. And most of the philosophy courses, I mean, I took the basics like political philosophy and logic and ethics and things like that. But I also, most of my kind of elective philosophy courses were things like philosophy of psychology, philosophy of natural science.
Sure.
I really loved those courses that blended those things. And I guess I don't know if a lot of people realize that those are whole fields unto themselves, that they really do play nicely together.
Well, I always loved philosophy since I discovered it as an undergraduate. I thought it was a great thing, but I never thought it would be part of my life because the part of philosophy I liked the best was actually moral and political philosophy. I didn't realize until years later that there was a subfield of philosophy, like you say, where really they're just doing physics, but it's the kind of physics that would never get you a job in a physics department, right? The deep mysteries of quantum mechanics or what happened at the origin of the universe, things like that. So, and that's really my jam. That's really what makes me super duper happy. And that's what I'm doing now. Yeah.
Oh, I love that. And I bet you there's some crossover with, so my approach in psychology is an existential approach. So it's really kind of based in existentialist philosophy. And a big part of what we grapple with our clients are, especially because I work in like end of life and psycho-oncology, are questions like meaning. Well, a lot of existential psychologists focus on what they call the four givens of existence. So fear of death, meaning and purpose, loneliness, and the relationship between freedom and responsibility. Like these are kind of like deep existential questions that we believe underlie a lot of mental strife. And so it's interesting when I think about things like meaning, purpose, why are we here, where are we going, and even things like death, fear of death, loneliness, togetherness, being alone without feeling lonely. There is something very fundamentally like physics oriented about these questions. Like they are philosophical, they are psychological, but when you're grappling with the big questions in physics, aren't you also grappling with like, how did this happen? How did we end up here? And what's going to happen in the future?
Yeah, unsurprisingly, I could not agree more. I mean, maybe some physicists would take a different tack, but I think that one of the reasons why I love physics so much is it does impinge on the biggest possible questions. You know, the story I always tell, so I've apologized to any listeners who've heard me tell it before, but I fell in love with physics at a young age, reading about black holes and the universe and quarks and leptons. But the thing that would stop me from going to sleep and keep me up at night was I was just thinking about the universe and eventually hit upon the question, well, what if the universe had never happened? What if we had never been there? And then that would, no more sleep for me after that, that night. And I even wrote my book, The Big Picture, to sort of think about exactly those questions. And I also think that maybe physics has something to answer as well as to sort of pose those questions. I do think that thinking about our lives in terms of things that are compatible with the laws of nature is a good way to think about them and maybe even illuminating.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And I think I'm curious about your take. I'm going to take you so far away from your book in this podcast episode, but we'll come back to it. I promise.
Whatever.
The deeper I get into existentialist views of psychology and things like, constructivism, how spooky, the harder it is for my sort of skeptical and staunchly kind of logical positivist colleagues to find common ground. I mean, obviously there's a lot of common ground. I still consider myself a scientific skeptic for sure. I'm still very interested in the answers that the scientific method can help us uncover. That said, I also have a deep feeling after working with so many people who came from so many various backgrounds through the social justice lens that even though there is a reality out there, a consensual reality out there, our lives, our experiences are colored by all of our surroundings, by our environment. And so I'm curious, as somebody who's like so physics oriented, but who's grappling with these big philosophical questions, how you feel about views like constructivism, this idea that we to some extent construct our realities.
Well, it's a complicated thing, I would say. I mean, I do completely agree with you. I'm on your side. If I were to put it in very simple terms, I think that skeptics or scientists more generally really ought to take seriously the fact that human beings exist and have feelings and,
that we aren't like lab animals. Yeah.
Well, this was exactly what I preached in the big picture, that there's reality. I'm a big believer in reality, but there's more than one way of talking about reality. And the way that you talk about it at the human scale can be very different than the way you talk about it at the level of fundamental physics or even biology. They have to be ultimately compatible with each other. You can't say that at the level of human beings, I can fly, defying gravity, because that's not going to work. But the fundamental laws of physics leave you a lot of room to do other things that are hard to predict unless you really focus on the human level by itself. So I'm not someone who thinks that you literally construct reality, but you absolutely construct what you think are the best ways of talking about reality. And those ways can be different depending on your purposes in the moment.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that I'm somewhere in that area too. Like when you dig deep into constructivist philosophy, you see that there's, the logical positivists kind of on one side of the extreme spectrum, and then the, like, I guess you could call them solipsists on the other side, who are literally like, you do not exist except as a figment of my imagination, which is an interesting thought experiment, but I don't know how many serious philosophers actually think that way. And I think it's probably somewhere, I mean, I tend closer to the logical positivist side, but I give a lot of space for that idea that human perception is messy. It's very messy. And we are not tape recorders as much as we want to believe that we are.
Well, I think that there's a distinction that in philosophy gets talked about a lot, philosophy of science, which is realism versus idealism, or physicalism versus idealism. I guess it would be realism versus instrumentalism, which is the question, do your scientific theories attach onto things that are real, or are they merely tools for making predictions? Whereas physicalism versus idealism is the fundamental base of reality physical stuff, or is it somehow mind or consciousness?
Oh, interesting.
In that latter distinction, I'm very much a physicalist. I think that mind and consciousness arise out of physical stuff. And that's the leading feeling among professional philosophers, but it's not like 99%. It's more like 60% feel that way.
Right, because you still have like your monists out there. You still have your individuals who your dualists, I guess. Wait, now I'm mixing those two things up. Yeah, I said that backward. You still have your dualists out there. You still have your individuals who, you're right, think that these things can't actually be grappled with in terms of stuff. And then on the flip side of that, you have what I view as like your irresponsible armchair physicists who will use sort of things like multiverse theory or things like principles within quantum mechanics to try to explain consciousness in a way that is like full pseudoscience and woo. And so it must be frustrating for you to be in that space where you're like well trained and you're truly grappling with these questions, and see people who are not in that space pretending or masquerading to be in that space and making wild claims that like no serious academic agrees with.
Yeah, you learn to pick your battles, and my own attitude towards battle picking is I want to pick the best battles, the battles against the best people. So yeah, there's plenty of crackpots out there. When I wrote my book on quantum mechanics, I did an experiment by going to Amazon and typing the word quantum into the search bar under books, and found books on quantum yoga and quantum healing and quantum prayer and quantum leadership. And, there were no equations in any of these books. There's no...
And did they use any real principles from quantum mechanics? Of course
they
not.
Just made it up. It's. I think that quantum mechanics is even more abused than Darwinian evolution when it comes to scientific theories being used for wrong reasons. But yeah, but that happens. But I don't care. Like life is too short. There's plenty of people out there. I'm going to leave that to you and your friends to smack that down, because I do have, on my podcast, I've had people like Philip Goff and David Chalmers, who are very respectable philosophers, who are panpsychists, or at least panpsychist friendly, where they think that
I had Goff on the show too, and I was like, wow.
Yeah, I know. And
wow.
Look, as a guy, as a person, Philip is great. I just love him. I love talking to him. And then, in the middle of a conversation, he'll say, like, so what probability do you put on many worlds quantum mechanics being right? And I'll say, like, I don't know, something like 90 or 95%. And he'll be, wow, that's amazing. How could you put that much? And I'm like, dude, you believe that electrons are conscious. So don't tell me that my views are just impossible to comprehend.
And isn't it great when you meet people? I mean, I do think there's something, again, from a psychological perspective, so fascinating about engaging with people who are, as you mentioned, serious academics, who are great people, who are like smart. They're legitimately really intelligent people who think deeply about this stuff. And then, for example, they believe that electrons are conscious, or they believe that there is like a sky man who like dictated how the universe was developed. And it's like, wow, that's actually what you believe. I respect it, I guess, but it's so hard for me to empathize with it. I have to with my patients all the time. But as an atheist, I can include those as other alternative views and still see the world for what I believe it is, which is like lacking in all of that kind of magic.
Yeah, and it's a tricky thing. And I think that, so again, this takes us even further afield, but there's a set of very big questions about how much it should affect our own personal credences when people who we meet and think and seem are pretty reasonable and smart are holding views that are completely crazy pants. Like,
right.
Does that mean we hold those views? Like, I do worry about that a little bit, but you got to do the best you can do. And someone who is sort of a deist, someone who thinks that there's some kind of ineffable God that is just out there sustaining the world, I can get along with. Like, I see no reason to think that. But someone who is just a traditional Christian, who think that God tried to communicate to us by sending part of himself or his son, depending on how you theologize it, and then like a guy who never wrote down any books, never gave any instructions, just appeared in one poor village and talked to some friends, and like that was God's way of telling us how to be good people. I'm like, I can't even imagine how you could believe that, even though I've met super duper smart, really intellectually powerhouse people who believe exactly that. So I have to take into account that different people can reach wildly different conclusions, even though they're extremely rational, evidence-based people.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess it just kind of goes into this idea of confirmation bias and motivated reasoning. And just like you said, it makes you really stop and go, where am I practicing these things? What's my motivated reasoning?
Yeah, exactly.
Obviously.
Like, when you see someone else believe something that you think is completely wacky, it's too easy to come up with rationalizations to explain that based on biases and motivated reasoning and so forth. But then it's so hard to apply that to yourself.
Yep. So hard. And so I guess we have established, of course we did in both of our previous episodes, for anybody who maybe hasn't heard those, that we are both pretty staunchly atheistic thinkers, pretty staunchly scientific thinkers. And now you have a new book because you are also a prolific writer. I don't know how the freak you do this and like maintain your academic positions and like live a life, because you also have a life. You're not just like in the library all day, every day. Like, I know you have a life. You're a friend of mine.
Tiny itty bitty life. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So your new book, The Biggest Ideas in the Universe, Space, Time, and Motion. I guess I'm curious, what prompted you to write this book, and how would you say that it's kind of different from some of the explanatory things that you focused on in your previous volumes?
Well, you may remember a few years ago, we had a pandemic. We still do. And there was a lockdown, and people were like thinking, how can I personally contribute to fighting this pandemic? And I am certainly well aware that I'm not a virologist or an epidemiologist or a public health expert or anything like that. But I had friends, in particular, Lauren Gunderson, who's a friend of mine who is a very prolific playwright, who took to the internet to offer free classes in playwriting. And I thought that was a good idea. And I can't teach people playwriting, but I can teach them physics. So I did a series of YouTube videos. I literally went to Sammy's Camera in Pasadena. I don't know if you ever went to Sammy's, but
they're the only place that still developed my film.
Exactly, right. And so I put myself in their hands and I said, look, I want to make YouTube videos. I have no idea what I'm doing. I need a green screen. I need a good microphone or whatever. And they helped me out, and literally a day later, they were locked down. And so I did it at the last possible moment. Started making YouTube videos.
Good job.
And you could see both the evolution of my video skills and my hair over the course of the videos, right? Because it's lockdown. And at the end, I had 48 videos that were like an hour and a half long each. That's a lot of material. And so, I'm going to turn that into a book. And the gimmick of it was that I taught physics for people who don't know any physics, but I did not shy away from doing the math. So there are a lot of equations in the book. And this is book one. There's going to be 2 other books. It's going to be a trilogy. So I do all of classical physics in this book, from Aristotle through Newton up to Einstein. There'll be quantum mechanics in the next one, and then complexity in the one after that. And you'll learn the ideas behind Einstein's equation, behind the Schrödinger equation. You will understand what those symbols mean by the time you've read these books.
Oh, I love that. So this is sort of your first popular foray into like the foundational basics and trying to be as inclusive as you can, but in a very reader-friendly way. But also, as you mentioned, without leaving out the science, the math and the science that is fundamental to these basic explanations.
Yeah, usually when I write a book, I mean, I do have a philosophy that it better be worth it writing the book. Like, I'm not going to write a book just for the sake of keeping myself busy. I don't need that. So most of my books have an argument to make. They're defending a potentially controversial point of view, whether it's about the arrow of time or naturalism or quantum mechanics. And as opposed to a book that is purely pedagogical, that says, let's just put aside the controversies and the speculations and focus on what we know. So that's exactly what this one does. I do not speculate that much in this book. It's not about the multiverse, not about superstring theory or quantum mechanics. It's like, here are the ideas in physics that will still be around 1,000 years from now. And therefore, the question is, can you do that in a different way? And the way that I'm doing it that is trying to be different is starting that I assume you can multiply numbers, but I don't assume you know calculus or vectors or anything like that. And I teach you all that stuff along the way. And I claim that it's not that hard. It's not for everybody's taste, but I think for a lot of people, they will realize, oh my goodness, those things just looked like little hieroglyphics to me before, but now I kind of know what those symbols mean.
Oh, I love that. There's almost like a out of step chronology to how you chose to write, because I bet you if people read these books, they will be able to better appreciate your older books as well kind of start now.
So one thing you notice as an author is, and both my readers and my publisher are a little bit frustrated by this, but my books are all different. They're not for the same people. So I absolutely have Amazon reviews for the new book saying 1 star, there's equations in this book, I don't like it. I've read all of his other books, but this one I don't like. And there's also plenty of 5-star reviews saying, thank God, finally someone is giving me the equations and in a form that I can understand. I think that that's what it should be. You shouldn't expect that just because you have an author that you liked before, if they write a different book, it's going to be the same book again, on a different topic. So my books are very heterogeneous, and I haven't even written my mystery novel yet. So that's really going to be a departure.
I often think about the relationship between trade publications and academic publications. I'm co-editing an academic text right now about pseudoscience and psychotherapy, and it's clearly written for people who already work within the mental health field, because it kind of takes for granted that you already know certain things, and it uses some language that maybe a popular psychology book wouldn't necessarily use. But at the same time, I think about maybe courses for non-majors, so like physics for philosophy majors, or I guess you see this mostly with the hard sciences, right? Like you'll see physiology or anatomy and physiology for like kinesiology or nursing majors, but not necessarily biology majors. And I wonder, should we be seeing more crossover with trade publications? Like, would the biggest ideas in the universe series be great for like a physics for a non-major course?
It absolutely could be, I think, except for one thing, which is that there's no homework. There are no problem sets. So I think that's exactly why, it's not, maybe you could use this for a course, and I think that it could be rewarding, but it's not meant for that. And I'm a big believer that, again, that's okay. You should have courses meant for different things. These books are really meant for, to make it a little bit oversimplified, 16-year-olds and 60-year-olds. People who are like kids who are, they know that this stuff is cool. They feel like the good stuff is being held back from them, and they would like to get it before they have to take 5 years of college. And also people later in life who said like, kind of wish that I had learned more physics when I had the chance when I was in college and, taken those courses. Because unless you're taking college courses, we just don't let you learn this stuff. And this is literally for everybody else.
I love how you put that too. I love the framing there. Unless you're taking college courses, we don't let you learn this stuff. It's not that we don't make you learn this stuff. We don't let you. It's like there's this velvet rope, literally, around some of this information. Oh, and that's not fair. And I think you see this across a lot of academic fields. There's sort of the quote professional view, and sort of if you're in the know, then you know all the terminology and you can speak, at a certain level. And if you're not, then you only get sort of the popular, watered down quote. And I hate this phrase. You see it all the time when you're doing public science communication. But here, I think it's apropos, quote, dumbed down versions of things. And people are smart enough to not need the dumbed down version.
Well, I like all of it, I think, but that's the point. There's no reason for there to be a gap in between. There's a spectrum, right? And it's not going to be for everybody, but it's going to be for some people, and that's okay. If it's for 1% of the people, so 1% of the human beings on Earth buy my book, I will be happy. I'll be completely content with that.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. 1% is still a whole lot of people, isn't it, Sean?
That was my hint. I was hinting. Yes. Still a lot of people.
Oh, that's great. That's great. So how long does it take to write a book like that, though? Because that's a lot. It's like you have to be as inclusive as possible, but still make it. I mean, how many pages is this? It's only it's less than 300 pages. Yeah,
we tried to keep them short. We'll see how long volume 2 is. It's going to be harder to keep that one short because there's a lot to say. But it's hard. It's even hard to say how long it takes to write a book like that. Effectively, about a year. But of course, many other things are happening at that time. And of course, also, I did a lot of the preliminary work by doing the videos. And because this is purely pedagogical, and I'm not trying to be clever about things I don't already understand myself, I don't have to do a lot of research for these books, right? That saves an enormous amount of time.
You teach this stuff.
I teach this stuff. I learn this stuff. I use this stuff in my job. So it's really more, the effort is really trying very hard to make sure, what will the misconceptions be that people have in their brains, and trying to head them off at the pass a little bit and speak in a language that everyone can understand.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I'm curious actually, because I don't think we really got into this, but at Johns Hopkins, we talked about the different things that you teach, but do you have a quote? I know it's a little bit different when you're doing theoretical physics, but do you have a lab? Do you have students? Are you doing scholarship there?
Oh, yeah, I will. I just got there, so I'm just sort of beginning to talk to some people. But what some friends of mine and I are doing is founding what we call the Natural Philosophy Forum at Johns Hopkins. And so this will be scientists and philosophers who want to think about the natural world in a philosophical way. So trying to do better at understanding the fundamental nature of reality. And that might be neuroscience, or it might be physics, or it might be theoretical computer science, or whatever. And so we're going to have a group of people, which includes not only faculty, but postdocs and students and whatever, all talking to each other and writing papers and pushing the academic enterprise forward.
Oh my God, are you going to do any sort of like visiting scholarship? How do I apply? That sounds incredible.
If you know the founders, send me an email.
It really does. I mean, it's one of the things I often think about obviously, there are certain academic fields that are a little bit more like translational or more, and then there's some that are more theoretical. And I feel like I'm in a very practical field as, working on becoming a psychologist, but all of my tentacles are in the theoretical. It's deeply the foundation of the work that I do. And so I've always dreamed about these sort of academic forums. And that's what I turn every supervision session that I do. I supervise kind of younger students in the program. Every supervision session is like philosophy club, and some of them love it and some of them hate it. So I see some blank stares sometimes. But I've long dreamt about having a forum for that, and I just don't think it exists enough in academic circles, which is bananas because we are all working towards or have PhDs, doctors of philosophy.
Yes, and one of the great ideas, the co-founder of this forum here at Johns Hopkins is my friend Janan Ismail, who is a former guest on my podcast. She's a philosopher. A real philosopher, not just someone who has like a split appointment. And she had the idea that, one of the services we can offer is if a scientist anywhere, just visiting or whatever, not necessarily at Hopkins, but if a scientist wants to come and get some philosophical feedback on the big questions that are raised by the work they're doing, again, whether it's an evolutionary biologist or a neuroscientist or whatever, we can do that. We love talking to scientists I am a scientist, of course. I realize that as I said that. I do love talking to scientists also, but I love them talking to each other. I love a mutual spirit of respect where we're allowed to ask the big questions and take them seriously, but also take them rigorously, like not just shoot the shit after dinner or whatever, but, realize that we've made some progress in some of these hard questions and be very rigorous and serious about it.
Yeah, and challenge some of the, I guess, the preconceived, or maybe I should say the foundational notions within certain fields that people take for granted because they've just always been that way or they've always thought that way. Like I often think about philosophy as an engine for social justice, and how many of these fields, these fields are all founded by people, and we're grappling with consensual reality through the lens of people. And who are the people who have long done this work? Not the people who are most represented on our planet. And so I love that component of philosophy as well. And it's something that I think we don't always spend enough time on.
Yeah, I envision someday, it's not that I'm ever going to do it, but I think it'd be great to have a university where there were no departments, where there were faculty and students and everything, and there were classes, but you didn't have to have these constant arguments, which I sat in on, okay, so this person does biology and physics. We want to hire a biophysicist, but are they really a physicist or are they really a biologist? Here's an economic historian. Are they really an economist? Are they really a historian? And it's just so tiresome. And it absolutely holds back academia and intellectual life completely. So whatever we can do to make that better.
Oh, I agree. You even see that in psychology. It's amazing how much you see that even between the orientations. Like somebody who's a cognitive behaviorist versus an existentialist. They're just like, they're coming at every conceptualization, every conversation from wildly different perspectives. And I think you see it in physics too, right? Like a string theorist is going to kind of look at a physics problem very differently than you would, because you're not a string theorist.
Yeah, and people get very emotional about their, different commitments to this or that. And I do have absolute commitments. I think that certain things are worth doing, certain things are less interesting. But I try to be pretty pluralistic about letting smart people do what they think is really important. Because what do I know?
Right. I'm curious, and not to get kind of meta here, and I feel like it's unfair because she's not sitting here with us, but also I want to live vicariously because I miss your wife, Jennifer. People who remember on my show, I think it was either right before or right after your episode, I did an episode with Jen Willette, your wife, because we recorded them in the same sitting, I think, which is really funny in your old place. And she is a writer, but a very, very scientifically minded writer. And I'm curious how much of your, I don't know, approach to science has been shaped by your relationship with your brilliant and slightly perspective shifted wife, Like she must influence the way you think a little bit.
Well, absolutely influences the way I think about writing. That part is easy to see. And that's an important part of it because it's hard to draw a sharp line between the science and the writing, right? Both are thinking about things and trying to make sense of them. Ultimately, it comes down to that. And, Jennifer has put an enormous amount of thought into her craft of writing. And she doesn't want to be an academic trying to do original research. She wants to take interesting ideas and write about them in a way that everyone can enjoy and learn. And, happily she's able to find employment doing that. But that's a really, really important part of the ecosystem, I think. And I'm a believer more widely than that, Twitter and TikTok and all these things are important, as well as ponderous academic monographs. And that there's a way to be good at all of them, videos and audio and whatever. So I think that there's a snobbery that inevitably creeps in when people do one thing to the exclusion of other things, but they all have their own charms.
Absolutely. Are you on TikTok, Sean?
No, because that's not
what
I would be good at. My publisher did say when I had this book coming out, they're like, TikTok is a big new thing. Do you want to make some TikToks to sell the book? And I had to say, look, I'm like I just said, I'm very glad that people are doing it. I think it's a good thing to be done. My kind of thing is exactly wrong for TikTok. So let's acknowledge that. Let's not pretend otherwise. I mean, you might think that Twitter is the same way because Twitter is even shorter, but Twitter, you can link to things, right? You're not trying to convey a deep idea in a tweet. You can say, look, here's a deep idea on a different web page, read it. Whereas the TikTok is more about inspiration and fun and things like that, which is great.
Yeah, I mean, I think the same way between, Twitter and Instagram. I am now on Instagram and have been for many years, but I was even a little bit resistant to Instagram at first because I was like, Twitter is where words are spoken. You know what I mean? Like Twitter is about ideas and Instagram is about visual inspiration. And I'm not an overly visual thinker. I don't take a lot of photos. It's not how I think about the world. I think in words. And so Twitter has always been, spoken to me deeply because of that.
Yeah, no, I have an Instagram, but I really don't use it. So Twitter I love because it lets me blow off a little bit of steam. What I have to do is, and I have to resist the temptation to just insist that everyone else does this. But man, when dumb things happen, people cannot resist talking about it on Twitter. And so much of Twitter is talking about the stupidest things that happen in the world rather than the smartest things that happen. And I think that's too bad.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a human thing, right? It's like you're trying to find a restaurant or a barber or anything on Yelp. And of course, you can't really you have to take the reviews with a grain of salt because when do people leave reviews? When they're pissed.
When they're right? Yeah, exactly. It's a very, as a psychologist, this, but still it bugs me. I'm like, why are you just spreading these dumb ideas? Just don't stop it. Even if you're rejecting them, you're still giving them more attention.
Right. And why not, if you're going to do that? It's sort of like our view. I'm going way far afield here, but it's sort of like the responsible journalist view of covering active shooter situations. Don't use the shooter's name. Always call them the shooter. Like you really should try and minimize the negative impact and maybe offer, for example, if somebody does something dumb, instead of just going and talking about how dumb it is, say, okay, this was a dumb thing, be minimal about it and say, these are the alternatives. Like this is a smart way to live in the world.
If you can use it as an excuse to talk about something smart, that's okay. But maybe then once you're there, just talk about smart things.
Totally agree. And I use Twitter actually. I mean, I do engage with people on Twitter because, I like it for that reason. But the vast majority of my tweets are aggregations of cool science that's happening. Like I go through my feed reader every week and I pull the best science writing that I can find about the most cool things that people are writing about. And then I share I think it's 5 different science stories a day on my Twitter. So it's like an aggregator.
Yeah, and that serves a good purpose, and it's not making people just angry and bitter. So that's good. Thank you.
Exactly. Yeah, there's enough of that, right?
Yes.
Oh gosh. Well, I mean, speaking of that, your faculty appointment and sort of the work that you're doing, you really do think about politics utilizing, and I love this because it's sort of the why multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary thinking is so necessary. Like you have a lens that was shaped through years and years and years of training as a physicist. And so you can think about these things with like your flavor, with your perspective. But I'm curious, how does that crossover work when you're thinking about natural philosophy, but politics and human interaction and governance and power, all of those fascinating things? How does that play into physics?
Yeah, and there's always a temptation that physicists love to give into to think that physicists are smarter than everybody else, so they're going to waltz in and solve all the problems in all of the areas of the world. And that's not what I'm trying to do. When I say the physics of democracy, which is the course I'm teaching and will someday be a book that I'll write, it's not we're going to solve all the problems of democracy by thinking like physicists. That is not the philosophy. The idea is that we can learn something or even just be inspired to come up with a good idea about society and democracy by thinking about related or analogous problems in physics. As I say in the new book, in The Biggest Ideas in the Universe, physics has a special way of making progress by really oversimplifying things, to be honest, right? The spherical cow philosophy. And it works in physics, and it won't always work in other areas, but it's still a strategy. When you have something that is really, really hard, like what should we do with society, or how should you vote to best express the will of the people? Let's take all the possible inspirations we can get, right, and not try to be dogmatic or imperialist about it, like my way is the right way, but like maybe this sheds some light on something in an interesting way.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. I think that's I'd like to see that more often, right? I'd like to see that with, I don't know, a feminist philosopher applying her views to any fill in the blank chemistry or it's like I'm always fascinated when you see. I recently had somebody on the show named Cara Cooney, who is an Egyptologist at UCLA, and her entire kind of, not all of her work, but a most recent book that she wrote was about these like ruling hierarchies within Egypt and sort of the patriarchal, misogynistic views that have kind of persisted to this day. And then the times when women did hold on to power, how it happened, what we can learn from it. It was such a fascinating approach to kind of the sleepy way that we often learn about ancient Egypt. And that's what I'm talking about. It's like when a person can come in who sort of breaks the traditional mold because they come from a different field. So they don't think like everybody in that field.
Yeah. And, it's again, yet another balance to strike in an area where it's easy to be extremist on one side or the other. You should be open to different kinds of perspectives, different ideas coming in, without saying that they're all equally good, right? At the end of the day, you make a judgment,
sure.
and you say like, no, okay, that didn't work. Like, we're moving on now. And that's also fine. So human beings don't really like to live in ambiguity, and that's kind of an issue, right? I mean, there's a very subtle intellectual fallacy, which is basically thinking that the only probabilities are 100%, 0%, or 50%. Either we're sure that it's right, sure that it's wrong, or we have no idea whatsoever. But the real world has a lot of 80% or 10% probabilities, and you have to take those seriously. 10% things happen all the time.
Oh, I'm so glad you say that. Lots of times when I'm discussing sort of the philosophy of psychotherapy with individuals and asking these big questions that seem like easy, take for granted questions, but they're really not, like, why therapy? Why do people seek care? Like, what is the point? What are they trying to get out of it? Like, that's not an easy question to answer. And one of the things that I keep coming back to, it's not the only thing, but it's an important thing, is how do we learn to live in ambivalence? Because most people are taught, not overtly, but societally, we're shaped and taught to believe that if we have two opposing feelings, let's say I love somebody and I resent them at the same time, that I have to choose one and sublimate the other. That's the only way to navigate the world. But the truth is, I can love someone and resent them at the same time. And I have to learn how to live with that. I have to learn what ambivalence means. And I think that that's kind of an example of exactly what you're talking about. We can feel conflicting things, we can think conflicting things, or we can operate within these probabilities that aren't always so clean.
Yeah, and or we can just admit that we don't know, but there's a difference between not being certain and not knowing, right? Like there's some things we're pretty 99% sure about. That doesn't mean we're 100% sure. Like I see people all the time paraphrasing things that I say as that I'm certain about something, even though I never use that word, right? Because I know that that's not a good way to talk. But people just naturally say, like, if you think something is probably true, then you're certain about it. And that's, I don't know, school maybe trains us to think that way. There are right or wrong answers. This is always what I say when people ask me, is there a way that science education can be better? Teach more about the process of science and the fact that we don't know ahead of time. There's no answers in the back of the book. We're making guesses and trying to test them rather than just teaching them the conclusions we've already reached and grading them on their memorization of it.
Yeah, it's so sad because it completely does ignore the actual nature of science itself. With like the scientific method itself is uncertainty. Like that's what we're constantly doing. Yeah, you're right. The way we teach it is like it's so hindsight oriented, which is, I think, dangerous. And it reflects in almost every aspect of our lives. Like our democratic politics are so shaped by this because our politicians have to be sure. And if they change their minds or they evolve, they're seen as like flip-floppers. They're seen as people who can't commit. And like, it's like the one trait I want in a leader is that they can learn and grow. And we think it's the worst trait a leader could have.
Yeah, and I do try a little bit to get this across in the books. Like I make jokes about, here's the different ideas people have, and now I will tell you the right one. And of course, sometimes people choose not to hear the joking attitude there. But when there's true ambiguity and there's true differences that we don't know the right answer, then I try to say like, look, here's the options that are on the table, and that's okay, right? That's not. I remember a very sort of a little tiny epiphany I had reading about this journey of a woman who was deep into the New Age movement and eventually became more basically a scientific kind of skeptic. And she said that the thing that clicked for her is when she reached a really hard question, like where did the universe come from or whatever it was. When she asked scientists, they would sometimes say, yeah, I don't know. And when she asked her New Age people, they would always have an answer. They would never not know. And she goes, that's a little suspicious, actually.
Right. It's this idea of like open-mindedness and skepticism versus dogmatic certainty. And those things, like you find dogmatic certainty in certain life philosophies and views. You find it in religion very often. Not all religions. There are some very, like you were mentioning before, like more philosophical, deistic kind of, or some more like Eastern religions do tend to be more philosophically minded. But in the kind of fundy religions, right? Like the staunch organized ones where there's like social control as a major component of their development. It's like, nope, this is how it is. And you don't have to think about it anymore. You get to just, I'm telling you what it is. So now you don't have to worry, which I think is comforting to many people when they're earlier in their identity development, but can be very stifling the deeper you go in self-searching and self-knowledge.
Well, I think also this is probably, I should be asking you this as the psychologist, but there's probably just different personality types that have a different comfort level with ambiguity, right? Probably if I knew the big five better, there would be some way
Ocean.
Right. Okay,
so
good.
I think there's a few of them in there. So open-mindedness, clearly the first one. Like if you're not very open-minded, that's probably, you're going to be less skeptical. Conscientiousness, I think that plays into it. Agreeableness, extroversion, introversion, maybe not. And then neuroticism. So I actually think 4 of the 5 probably do play into how easily you could, for example, find yourself in a cult, how easily you believe in conspiracy theories.
Yeah, I had a great conversation with the philosopher T. Wen on my podcast, and he is mostly, his academic work is on the philosophy of games, like what makes a good game, why do we like games, and things like that. But then he extends it to gamification in the world. And he has a whole theory of why we love cults so much. And a lot of it is just because they provide clear answers to every question, right? Like simple, clear answers. It's not, the answers don't make sense and they don't fit the data, but they're there and they're simple and they're clear. And that's enormously compelling to a lot of people.
It's comforting. I think about my parents and how they were both raised Catholic because my dad's Italian, my mom's Puerto Rican. Of course, they were raised Catholic. They converted to Mormonism together. Why? They're smart people. They're thinking people. Why did they convert? Because Catholicism, even though it is in itself kind of a fundy, basic religion, it has all these weird things. Like there's the trilogy, not the trilogy. That's funny. What do they call it? The
Trinity. The Trinity.
The Trinity. Thank you. The trilogy.
Yes.
And it's like, well, how is God his own son? And this is very confusing. And their answers were always, oh, well, God works in mysterious ways. But when they went to the Mormon church, they're like, nope, 3 different people will explain to you exactly how it happens. And then you'll have your own planet and blah, blah, blah.
There you go.
What we find, it's like Scientology too, right? It gets kookier the more you have clean answers. But for some people, that's more comforting than living with ambiguity.
But I guess as a psychologist, are we allowed to say, that's wrong? They shouldn't think that way? Or do we have to say, like, okay, given your personality and predispositions, here's the way that you should deal with these ambiguities in the real world?
Well, and that's the confusing part about, maybe I won't say from the psychologist perspective, but now let's say from the psychotherapist perspective. So if I'm working with somebody in session, where is my agenda? Like I have to put my agenda on the shelf. And so this becomes really difficult, right? If it's mandated, if this is like, let's say a pedophile who was found guilty of some atrocious crimes and I'm there to help them with their rehab, it's a different purpose than somebody who's depressed and they want to feel better. And that's the biggest ethical question that I often grapple with. Let's say I have a client who is very, very depressed, but it's also clear to me that this client is very, very racist. In my view, working on their racism is going to help them with their depression. But if that's a sacred cow that they're holding on to, how do I navigate that with them?
Yeah, if all their meaning in life comes from being a racist, then it's hard. Yeah.
Right. And so these are really interesting questions about, I guess, people and how we interface and these different levels. Like, we talk about physics and we talk about the Big Bang and we talk about the universe as a whole and where it's going and how it's changing over time. And then we talk about, let's say galaxies. And then we talk about systems around stars. And then we talk about, more like geological systems. And then we've got societies. And then we've got individuals. And then we've got whole brains. And then we've got network level. And then we've got individual cells. And then, of course, we can go to atomic and then subatomic particles. And each of these systems has its own organization. Each of these systems has its own kind of stochasticity and its own things that like patterns, I guess, patternicity. And they all, I think, have a gestalt to them as well. I don't know if you believe in this kind of concept of the gestalt, that when they're working as a whole, there's, I guess, what's the word I'm looking for? Emergent properties that aren't necessarily there as we become very, very reductionistic.
I think that's a very tricky set of questions there. I mean, this is a research level philosophy issue that I'm very interested in myself. I do think that at the level of, once you get down to the level of fundamental physics, of electrons and protons and neutrons, there is a complete way of talking about the action of those particles that does not require talking about any bigger structures that they're in. The electrons in your brain act exactly the same way the electrons in interstellar space act, given the conditions immediately around them. But when you get to the levels of cells and people and societies, that becomes much trickier, because then the individual pieces are pretty complex themselves. And maybe a person in a certain context is just not the same as a person in a wildly different context. And I don't think that's something that anyone really has a very good understanding of right now.
Yeah, I think it's the same when we talk to individuals about sort of AI and neuroscience and the relationship between like computing and utilizing brain models for computing, neural nets and things like that, because you see across the academic spectrum wildly different views about like, we just haven't figured it out yet, and once we do, we'll basically be able to create consciousness on a computer chip, versus individuals who are like, no, we may never be able to capture that because
Right.
there is an emergent property that requires wetware. And so I love it too. I think it's a fascinating place to grapple with. And I tend on one side, but I'm not sure. Like, again, I could list you a probability maybe, because I definitely would never claim that hubris.
My own view on that question is that I'm perfectly happy to say in principle that you could be conscious and embodied on a machine. But I think that the actual current state of the art, if we're talking practicalities rather than in principle questions, the current state of AI radically underestimates the importance of embodiment in human consciousness in our lives. Like, we have bodies, we get tired, we get hungry, we have desires. Antonio Damasio talks about this all the time. And I think, that's possible to reproduce in principle in a computer, but maybe you don't want to, and certainly it's not easy. So I think we have a ways to go before we can take that stuff seriously, but it's good that we're moving in that direction.
Yeah, it is cool to see that there are many computer scientists who are specifically focused on things like sensory perception within computational platforms. Like, they're interested in computer vision, for example. They're interested in sensation and even like somatosensation. Because you're right, like every single thing, we take it for granted so much. Every single thing we do as human beings sort of comes from this embodied cognition. Even our language, like, we talk about things being over and under and above and beyond. It all has to do with where we are in space.
Yep. Yes. And we have desires, right? I mean, again, this is something psychologists, I guess, have figured out quite a while ago, but we have motivations and desires in ways that computer programs don't, right? They will follow instructions. They'll do, given you set them up in a particular way and run them. But if I leave my laptop alone for an hour, it doesn't get bored. And
you're right. And we need to eat and sleep and fuck and do all of these things that like are kind of like lizard brain. I don't like that phrase, but like our early brain development is like pining for.
And I think that's not irrelevant. It's not a little complication. That's kind of centrally
You're
important.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so central. Oh, I love it. I always take you so off topic, Sean, but I really this is why I love talking to you, because you're like willing to go there always with me.
We have places to go. I'm glad that you let me go to these places.
Oh, anytime. So I'm curious, obviously we've talked about so many different things. We did talk about your book. We didn't get too deep into it, but of course, the whole point is for people to see this as sort of foundational training. Yeah, just buy it and read it.
And then talk about it.
And then also, I think that these works are so important because I mentioned previously, once you have sort of taken in the level that you are motivated to take in with this fundamental physics in a very cleanly explained way, it then really does change you. It literally changes your neuronal architecture. And now when you encounter new problems and when you approach new questions, this knowledge, this plasticity that you underwent is helping you now connect new ideas to old. And that's why it's so important that we learn, but that's also why it's so important that we have foundational knowledge and that we're not doing, I don't know, I think about like, this is such a stupid analogy and example, but bear with me. I think about Picasso or something and like cubism and like interesting kind of non-conformist ways to do art. But Picasso was a fine artist too. And I think that we sometimes forget that in order to get creative and dabble, if we don't know the fundamentals at all, yeah, it's cool because you're not constrained, but also you're not reality testing very well. And you sort of need both. That's what creativity is. Creativity is coming up with new approaches to problems, but understanding why there are actual constraints.
Yeah, and I think I completely agree with you there. And the reason why I love physics and I chose it as sort of my home discipline is because it is one way of thinking about things and tackling problems, but it's kind of on one extreme, right? And if you can figure that one out, you can sort of then begin to learn other ones in an easier way than if you start from learning history. You can try to learn physics. It's all possible in any direction you want, but physics is like, a certain kind of weight training that allows you to then go and do other sports later on.
Yeah, I love that. Oh, I love that so much. So I got to ask you, because we're coming towards the end, and I always did this. I did this on my, I don't know if I did it on the first episode, because I don't know if I had this kind of ending bit back then, but I definitely did on the next episode. So I'm curious what your take is now. We're sort of post-pandemic. A lot has happened to the world. Our democracy is like really, really tenuous right now. So I would love to know from you the answer to those last two questions I always ask my guests, which are, when you think about the future in whatever context feels relevant to you, what is actually keeping you up at night right now? Where are you concerned, disillusioned, maybe cynical even, or at least, whatever. And then where are you finding your hope, your optimism? What are you truly looking forward to?
I think for the pessimism question, there's two different ways of thinking about that. I mean, one is on the sort of scientific existential risk kind of side. Climate change is obviously bad, but we know about that. Like, the people who are choosing to pay attention know about that. I do think that there are still lingering risks of nuclear war, which more people are paying attention to now. And there's super big risks from engineered pandemics and bioterrorism that maybe we're not paying attention to as much as we should. And it's not that hard to come up with a disaster scenario, especially now that you can genetically engineer things. I don't think we've really grappled with the threat to life on Earth that we ourselves have invented here, and I wish we did. But
wait, before you follow up,
yeah.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to interject. I have a great guest recommendation for you then on your podcast. There's a philosopher named Phil Torres, which is funny because we also have a mutual friend named Phil Torres who's an entomologist. Right. But Phil Torres, the philosopher, is an eschatologist, and he specifically focuses on secular eschatology. So this idea of how could the world, the universe, whatever, come to an end, not through religious purposes, but like through our own actions. And he really grapples with things like pandemics and nuclear war, and it's fascinating. So I don't know if you've ever met him or talked to him, but highly recommend.
I know Phil, and I've actually had I haven't had him on the podcast, but I've had other people talking about exactly these things. So I'm doing my little part to scare people into losing sleep at night.
Excellent. Anyway.
But meanwhile, I can't also not mention the fact that democracy is collapsing around our eyes. And that's the probability that we will lose democracy in the next 10 years is much bigger than the probability we'll die due to a bioengineered pandemic. So, and again, it's just weird to see people treating it as business as usual, right? The punditocracy, the media, the journalism landscape, they're trained to treat stories in a certain mode, in a certain register. And the fact that this one is different, even politicians, right? They're like, well, there's Republicans versus Democrats. And, no, it's actually kind of bigger and different than that, and they're just not taking it seriously, which is immensely frustrating.
Completely agree. I'm so with you.
On the optimistic side, like, I can go to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania on a Friday night and give a talk about Einstein's equation and get dozens of people to show up and really follow along and be happy about the whole thing. And it's not that I'm that great, it's that there are people out there who really want to know things. This is the motivating philosophy behind my podcast, behind yours, I'm sure, behind the books we write and all this stuff, that if anything, the desire to know things is underserved. Like we tend to be totalizing, as we said, 0% or 100%. And there's a lot of people who don't want to know hard ideas and don't want to think about it. So we kind of poo-poo, or, we pretend that society is against struggling with difficult ideas. But there's a lot of people out there who are really willing to do it if you give them the tools, give them the opportunity. So that's why I write a book full of equations. It's also why on my podcast, I don't just do physics, because I want people who are interested in physics to occasionally hear from a political scientist or a musician or something like that, because maybe those aren't the ideas they would immediately gravitate toward. But when talked about in the right way, they're like, oh yeah, this is really interesting. And, especially young people, I think that there's a lot of good human beings who really want to understand the world better and work to make it a better place. We just have to do what we can to make it possible.
I love that. So why don't you tell everybody a little bit about your podcast?
Sure. I have a podcast, in case I haven't mentioned that. It's called Mindscape. Comes out every week, and it's mostly me interviewing someone, but much as we're doing here, about usually their research. It's usually academics, usually people with a big idea to talk about. Sometimes we get creative. I had a very fun interview not that long ago with Daniels, the directors and writers of Everything Everywhere All at Once, the movie.
Yeah.
One of my first podcasts was with Wynton Marsalis, the trumpet player.
Oh, wow. Very cool.
As long as it's like good ideas presented in a fun way, then we're happy to do it.
Oh, I love that so much. And you started this during the pandemic, right?
No, the podcast was pre-pandemic. It's basically 4 years old now. Yeah.
Okay. So. Yeah. And pandemic is what, 3 years old now? Ugh, I have no timeline anymore.
2.5
years
only
two?
old. Yeah. 2.5 years old. Yeah. 2020.
How is that only 2.5 years
I know.
ago?
Feels like a century.
But also it was yesterday.
Yes,
a century and also yesterday.
Right.
Oh, gosh. Well, Sean, I'm always so thrilled to talk to you. I'm so happy for you that you have this new book. And I'm really actually excited about the influence that this new series of books can really have. We need more of this. And so I'm so thrilled that you yourself, I think one of the sort of most trusted names in this area, did decide to put in the effort and to offer this gift to us. So I, A, want to thank you for writing the book. B, thank you for always being so giving with your time. And C, for being such a good friend over the years.
Cara, thank you so much for having me on. It's always a pleasure. And I appreciate you letting me talk about all these crazy things. It's fun to talk about someone who is about the right amount of crazy.
Yes. And everyone listening, thank you for coming back and being the right amount of crazy week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.